stabbing the cereal with his spoon, saying, "Look, I'm a serial killer." I wonder, if I hadn't left, like what would have happened that night.
How would you feel if the person you lived with for years was abducting and killing other women at the same time? Well, this ex-wife can tell us exactly how it feels, the red flags, and how she found out the person she married was a serial killer. You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I am Brooke Makenna, and today's case is about a TikToker who recently came forward to say that she was the wife of a serial killer during the time of his murders. And I will have all of her TikTok and all of her social media information down below for you to follow her story because it's incredible. And she does want to do more with her story and more with her voice, which I think is so beautiful. But yeah, if you've never seen me before, please go ahead and subscribe if you like these sort of true crime mystery videos. It's what I am really passionate about making. And also, since this video is about TikTok, I have started posting on TikTok. If you would like to follow me there, it's just the same at Brooke Mckenna. I also want to thank our longtime sponsor, Rocket Money, a personal finance app that not only helps you manage your money better, but also will fight for you and help you lower your bills or cancel your unwanted subscriptions. For me, it's worth it to not have to spend hours on the phone talking to customer service or trying to keep track of all my different sorts of spending on spreadsheets and getting it all together. It's just all in one app on your phone. While moving into my first house, budgeting is my #1 priority, and it doesn't have to be so complicated. Basically, with Rocket Money, you can monitor your spending in different sort of categories and even get notified if you've gone over your budget on one of those. Rocket Money has helped to cancel over 500 million in subscriptions already. So if you want to try out Rocket Money, you can go to rocketmoney.com/Brooke Mckenna or click the link in my description to get started for free. You can even unlock more features with premium. Just go to rocketmoney.com/Brooke Mckenna. Now let's get back to the story. So it was 1996 in Virginia, and Sophia Marlene Silva was a 16-year-old. She wanted to attend cosmetology school after she graduated high school, and she was just a regular teenage girl with so much life ahead of her. However, on September 9th, she would get home from school. She would begin to do her homework on the front porch. This was of her family's home in Spotsylvania County, Virginia. But soon after, she would vanish with no witnesses. It was believed she was taken without any sort of a struggle. And her sister, who was inside of the home, had heard absolutely nothing and who just walked out and saw a grape soda and her papers for her homework still sitting there. And for the next month, the search for Sophia would not be fruitful. 13 days later, on September 22nd, a body would be found. However, this was not Sophia Silva. This was Anne Caroline McDaniel, who was found burned in Culpeper, Virginia. Now, Anne had lived in a group home for mentally and physically disabled adults due to her cerebral palsy and was last seen trying to hitchhike along the Route 29 highway. She told her roommate she was meeting with a mystery man, and then she vanished, and her body was found only an hour from where Sophia Silva had vanished from. This was a place that was extremely isolated that only the locals knew about, and this made investigators believe that this killer that had possibly struck twice was someone in the area. Finally, a month after Sophia's disappearance, her body would be found, but it was in Birchwood Creek off the highway Route 3. Now, this was around 48 minutes from her home, and Sophia was wrapped in a white cover, and during her autopsy, it was found that her private area hair, her pubic hair, had been shaved off. Fibers were also found on her body that were logged as evidence, and investigators actually ended up arresting a man named Carl Roosh through crime lab evidence that allegedly connected him to this murder. And so they put him into custody, but then the disappearances didn't stop. And so the FBI then retested this evidence, and it was found that there was no connection to this Carl. So he was released, the charges were dropped, but it also turned out that these two victims hadn't been the only ones. You see, 5 months prior to when Sophia and Anne had been murdered, There was cases back in May of 1996. Another body had been found in Culpeper, Virginia, just like Ann's, and this time it was a 25-year-old named Alicia Showwater Reynolds. She had been driving from her home in Baltimore, Maryland to Charlottesville, Virginia. But on March 2nd, which was 3 months before her body was found, her car had actually been seen abandoned on the highway Route 29 near Culpeper. Witnesses had come forward to say that they saw Alicia talking to a man in a pickup truck on the side of the road. This man was believed to be white, around 35 to 45 years old, with light to medium brown hair and around 5'10" to 6 foot. But they believed that she was murdered as well when they found her body in May. After she had vanished, though, several women came forward to say that a white male had also stopped them on that highway or tried to stop them while they were traveling. All 3 of these murder cases went unsolved. They couldn't even say for certain that they were connected. But little did investigators know that this killer was living a seemingly normal life in the area, with a wife and a regular job. It was only when Bonnie Lou Gower took to TikTok 28 years later that the intimate details about this killer's double life and his wife at home were revealed. You see, Bonnie started on TikTok with a popular TikTok trend where you put your hand up and you say, put a finger down if, and then you go into this kind of obscure story that you want to see if anyone else will relate to and be able to also put their finger down. Except no one expected this woman, this seemingly normal woman, mother, to have such a crazy story.
Put a finger down if you were married at 17, divorced by 25, remarried, had 2 children, and then 5 years later, the FBI showed up at your door to find out that your first husband was a serial killer who murdered 3 girls, one of which while you were still married. And then 20 years later, found out that he was actually murdering people before you were married and throughout your entire marriage.
She explained that when she was 17 years old, she got married to this man in August of 1988, and they had been introduced through her friend, who happened to be his sister. And so he was 8 years older than her, and after they married, they moved to Maine together for his job, and Bonnie said that she was happily married for a while, but her husband's red flags started to appear. They eventually moved to Maine as her husband was stationed in the military there, and he wanted Bonnie to be a stay-at-home wife. He refused to let her go to college or get a job, but in the end, she just wanted to please him. She was so young, she did as she was told.
But first, let's just talk about how we met. Okay, so I was friends with this girl in the 6th grade, and we wound up living 3 doors down from each other. So we got to be really close, and I'd go over to her house after school a lot. And her brother was in the Navy, and so he wasn't around that much, and he was a lot older than I was, but he was in the Navy, and he had come home on leave, and that's how I got to know him, and I kind of had a crush on him. He was her older brother and everything. When I was about 16, he started flirting with me and decided to ask me out, and honestly, that probably sounds like a really red flag, but my family, their biggest red flag was just the fact that he was a lot older than me, but they felt kind of comfortable because they already knew the family and they could see how much we liked each other, so they supported it. Things moved really quickly, and before I knew it, he asked me to marry him. And honestly, that sounds crazy, except that my life was really chaotic at the time. So when he asked me to marry him, I just jumped on it because it was really the best thing I had going for me.
Eventually, her husband would leave the military, and this was around 4 years into their marriage when they moved to Virginia, where her husband got a new job. Bonnie Lou would tell her viewers on TikTok that around the time of their move to Virginia, things began to shift. Her husband's cruelty towards her began, and he started picking on her for her weight. She said she gained around 10 pounds, and he told her that she was fat and needed to join Weight Watchers. He didn't want her to go to school, to find work, to make any friends, so she was completely isolated in this new place with no family.
And everything was fine at first. Honestly, I was happy to be married, and I had this, I was probably pretty immature fantasy about what married life meant, but I was happy to be up there and with him, and he very quickly took charge and let me know what my responsibilities were supposed to be to him as a wife, to clean the house and take care of all the cooking. And he was in the military, so there was like the lessons on how to properly launder his uniforms and do all of his creases just right. And I took all of this in and just worked really hard to please him. And I was happy to do that because, I loved him and I was wanting to make him happy. If I cheated on my diet, he would tell me, "You're going to wind up being fat like your mother, and you're just, you can't do that. You need to get back on your program." As time was going on, I was regretting my choice of getting married, but I had made a commitment, and I believed in that commitment and in marriage, and that it's forever and that you have to work on it. And I also, I had a lot of people tell me that I was too young to get married at the time. And so, I was pretty determined to prove everybody wrong that wasn't the case. Marriage was definitely not what I thought it would be. Eventually, he did allow me to go to cosmetology school. Since it was only a year, he was willing to allow me to be away from home so that I could get situated with a job that would pay me more money than minimum wage, and I could work regular hours. Going to cosmetology school really opened up my world and allowed me to get out of the house and make new friends. He didn't really like that very much, and he made it really clear from the very beginning that I wasn't to talk to anybody about our problems. He would explain to me that married people talk to each other about their problems. They don't talk to other people about their problems. Of course, at this point, I was 18, and I'm out there and I don't have any friends. I don't have any family, and it was back before cell phones, back before the internet or email or anything. And it was a long distance phone call that, kind of cost a lot of money back then, and he really limited the amount of money I was allowed to spend. Not having a lot of friends or anybody who I could talk to about my relationship, I really didn't know how different it was from the average marriage, and I really didn't have anybody to bounce things off of and find out what was normal, which I think was probably exactly what he wanted. Then everything shifted again because he got out of the military.
When girls began to turn up dead in their area, she didn't connect it to the fact that her husband began to act extremely stressed, asking Bonnie if she would bolt the country with him if he needed to go.
In November of 1992, Mark decided to get out of the military. The transition of him getting out of the military was a little rocky. He started having a lot of mood switches, and one day he came home. He was really frantic. He was just very anxious and beside himself, and he came in the door and he asked me, he said, "If I asked you to fly out of the country with me, would you do it?" And I was like, what do you mean? What the hell? Why would you ask me that? He's like, just answer the question. Would you go with me if I needed to get out of the country, if I wanted to leave the country? And I said, well, I don't know. Why do you need to go? I don't know if I want to live out. And he shut me down and he said, "No, if I needed to leave the country, would you go with me?" And I says, "Well, I guess so. I mean, we're married. Why am I going to stay here? Of course I'm going to go with you." And as soon as I said that, he just he breathed a big sigh of relief, and he's just like, "Oh, okay." He just kind of went on about his day, and he was just like, "Well, I just had a real, I don't know, I was just really stressed out. I just had a really rough day, and I just needed to know that, no matter what, you'd be with me."
Bonnie began to then endure her husband's rages, and slowly but surely she admitted to herself how unhappy she was and how bad of a decision it would be to bring a baby into this relationship and to start a family with this man.
One minute we would just be sitting there having a normal conversation, and the next minute he's up shouting at me and cursing, and one time he punched a hole in the wall. He would always wind up being emotional afterwards and crying and apologetic, talking about his childhood and all the terrible things his dad had done to him. And he'd swear that he was going to get help and that he would call somebody in the morning, and the morning would come and it would be as if nothing had happened, and he would just be carrying on with his day, and we never heard anything else about it. So when we were in our house about 6 months, and he flew into one of these rages. This was the third time it had happened, and the first time being maybe 6 months to a year before. It was like happening this was like the third time in 6 months, and it really shattered my bubble. It shattered this whole fantasy that I had. He started to realize that I was unhappy and started to make demands of me to figure out what it was that I was going to do, if I was going to stay or if I was going to leave. He agreed at first to go see a counselor, and we went to a couple of counseling appointments. I can't remember. I feel like I went on my own once. Maybe he went on his own once, and we went together. And when we went together afterwards, he basically told me that he felt like the counselor was on my side and that she was biased and that he wanted to find a different counselor, or he just wasn't even willing to go because he felt like, it was just really unfair and that she was against him.
Once when Bonnie and her husband were having a fight, Bonnie was being accused of cheating on him, and she would witness her husband blowing up at her, only to completely flip a switch when he answered the phone to talk to somebody else. After seeing this, she was so freaked out. He was so calm on the phone, so joyful, like a completely different person, that she immediately packed up her stuff and left the house and left her husband.
Everything came to a head this one night when I had come home from a ballet class that I was taking. And the class ended at 9 o'clock, so I got home around 9:15, and I walked in the door. And when you walked into our house, there was like the entryway, and off the entryway was an office. He was sitting at the desk in the office, immediately started berating me about, where have you been? What are you really doing? I know you're not taking a dance class. I know you're seeing somebody behind my back. Why don't you just tell me? When the phone rang, he decided to answer it while he was like in the middle of this fit he was beginning to have. As soon as he answered the phone, he flipped a switch, and he was like, "Hi, how are you? Gosh, it's so great to hear from you." And he walked right past me and went into the hallway and down into the basement to take the call. And it was at that time that I thought, I really need to get out of here. Shoot, I wonder, if I hadn't left, what would have happened that night.
Since Bonnie and her husband had moved to this area, Bonnie had noticed the staggering amount of disappearances and murders, but it didn't stop there.
When we were living in Virginia the last year, they thought at the time that there were 2 serial killers living among us. There was a lot of things that were happening. It was a pretty stressful time. It had a lot of us speculating about who this person was, and everybody was glued to the news. I remember one evening in particular, after watching the news, being concerned and expressing my concern to him about that I was afraid, and I came home late at night. I would work until 9 o'clock at night at this point at the salon. I was worried about being out late by myself. He assured me that he didn't really think I had anything to worry about because I didn't fit the profile of the women that were being killed. As serial killers usually have a particular type of person that they're looking for. So maybe they don't like their mother, or they're angry with their mother. So they try to find somebody who looks like their mother, and they can kill their mother without actually killing their mother. I distinctly remember a day Mark walks from the kitchen into the living room holding his bowl of cornflakes. And he's walking into the living room holding his bowl of cornflakes and the spoon, and he's stabbing the cereal with his spoon, saying, "Look, I'm a serial killer," as a play on words. Looking back at that, that's fucking terrifying, because he's basically telling me, hey, look at me, I'm a serial killer. He told me.
While Bonnie was in the midst of the divorce from her husband, 8 months after the third body had been found in Virginia, 2 sisters were abducted from their front yard. This was in Spotsylvania County, Virginia, where Sophia Silva was taken from as well. And on May 1st of 1997, Kristen Michelle Lisk, who was 15, and her sister Catherine Nicole Lisk, who was 12, got off their school buses and headed home. Christian loved playing football, and Catherine loved drawing and playing the clarinet. They were little girls. And when their father arrived home later, he would find Christian's backpack lying in the front yard, and his girls were nowhere to be found. Only 5 days later, they would both be found in the South Anna River. This was around 50 minutes from their home. They had been sexually assaulted and strangled, and the only evidence found on them were a few blue and pink fibers and a couple strands of hair. Investigators believe that these pink fibers could be from some sort of pink rug, but these fibers also match the fibers found on Sophia Silva. 5 years later, in 2002, Bonnie had moved on from her ex-husband. She had remarried. Her ex-husband had remarried. And this is where Bonnie would explain how she found out what her ex-husband really was. She got a knock on the door, and she could have never predicted that it would be the FBI standing in front of her.
The FBI showed up at my door. I had been warned the day before from his cousin, who had called me to tell me that the FBI was at her parents' place and asking questions. And all she knew was something about a girl in a box, and that he was on drugs and kind of deranged, and they were worried that maybe he was heading my way. The first question I asked the FBI when they told me was, how did I not know that this was going on when I was married to him for 8.5 years? Their answer to me was that serial killers are usually sociopaths, and sociopaths are really good at compartmentalizing. That in fact, if I had seen signs, then he wouldn't have been a sociopath, and he probably wouldn't have gotten away with the crimes the way that he did. And the FBI was just so happy to find me alive, beyond thrilled to see that I had survived that situation. Of course, I had no idea I survived anything. All I did was leave kind of a messed up marriage. The entire marriage was a lie. So that made me really look back at everything.
But how did they catch this man? Well, one brave survivor was a 15-year-old named Kara Robinson, and she had caught a serial killer. On June 24th of 2002, Kara had been at a friend's home outside watering plants for her when she was taken in South Carolina. Her friend went outside to find Kara, and that is when she realized that Kara was missing. The hose was still lying in the grass, and a neighbor then told investigators that they had seen a car with a man inside who had talked to Kara, but he believed she had voluntarily gotten into that car, even though her family knew that she would not have done that. Kara had been kidnapped, and they were so worried they were not going to find her. But the next morning, she would escape, still in her furry handcuffs, and tell the police that when she was outside, a man came up to her looking completely normal. He was offering her pamphlets, trying to give it to her parents. She said she was at a friend's house. He asked about the friend's parents, and when she said that they weren't home, he kind of leaned in towards her to give her the pamphlets. And Kara would say that a red flag sort of alerted in her head, but it was too late. He had pressed a gun to her, forced her to get into the car and into a plastic bin. He told her, "If you scream, I'm going to shoot you." He then stopped the car after a little while, got into the plastic bin, handcuffed her, bound her, and kept moving. The second time that he stopped, her container, still covered by a lid, was taken out of the car while she was still in it and drug into what she would then find was his apartment. And she was then forced to smoke weed. She was tied to a bed, and she was sexually assaulted. She was then forced to watch the news about her own abduction. Kara would later say that there was this voice in her head that told her her options were to stay and do what she was told and to escape, or she could panic and fight and maybe die. So she tried to stay calm for as long as she could, and she said it was kind of like a supernatural calm that washed over her. It was her survival instinct that really helped her to be able to make her abductor trust her. She even thought about once grabbing the gun next to her, but instead, she simply did what she was told. At one point, he put her back in the plastic container to answer a phone call, and she suffered a panic attack when that occurred. She had eventually fallen asleep, and when she woke up the next morning, her abductor was next to her, asleep as well. She fought out of her restraints and ended up sneaking to the door, and there was actually things blocking it, and she knew it would make some noise to get out, but she did it as fast as she could, basically moving everything, opening the door, and running. And 18 hours after she had been kidnapped, she flagged down a car driving by and told them to take her to the police station. She told the men in the car taking her to remember the door of the apartment. So Kara was able to tell investigators about this man from information she had forced herself to remember, such as that his car was a Pontiac Firebird, and also that she had the address of his dentist and his doctor, which he had on his fridge. He was also in the Navy, and he lived with a woman. Kara was then brought back to that apartment complex, and she couldn't really find which apartment it was. Of course, they all looked the same. She was running out of the apartment. Although because she knew the car, investigators began to ask the residents there who would drive that car. And finally, they got a name. This was Richard Mark Evanitz, and he lived with his wife in South Carolina. They had just moved there. He worked at an air compressor company, and coworkers said that women avoided him because he had anger issues and he had a misogynistic attitude. But by the time investigators arrived at his apartment, he was gone. Though investigators would find nude photos of young girls as well as videos and pictures on his computer. Girls' underwear was also found, quite a few of them, and there was a locked footlocker with newspaper clippings of the murders of Sophia Silva and the Lisk sisters inside. Inside of this home was also a pink rug that matched the fibers on the Lisk sisters' bodies. And Kara's handcuffs had been taken into evidence, and it was found that the blue fibers on these 3 murdered girls' bodies also matched the handcuffs. Notes were also found speaking about 2 Virginia girls that Richard had been stalking, and when they were told about this, they had no idea that they were being followed. He wrote what they looked like, what their address was, when they were alone. But after finding this, they realized that even though Kara had escaped, this was not just an abductor. This was a serial killer, and his next victim had escaped before he could murder her. Kara wanted to tell her abductor that choosing her was the biggest mistake he had ever made. But 3 days later, Richard was found in Florida after his sister called the police saying that they were going to have a meetup there. When Richard was surrounded, he surrendered, only to shoot himself to death. He had allegedly admitted to his sister that he had committed more crimes than he could remember. In his car trunk, a handprint was then found, and this belonged to Kristen Lisk. Investigators also found that Richard had called in sick the day the Lisk sisters had vanished. But now, even for the crimes that he could be linked to, he wouldn't be going to prison. He wouldn't be going to trial. Though investigators suspected many more murders had been committed by this man. Like Bonnie mentioned in her TikTok, she would later find out that not only did her husband commit 1 murder during their marriage, but possibly even more murders while they were together and possibly even prior to their marriage. Because when Bonnie met her husband, he was in the Navy. He was often traveling to different ports. He wasn't just in one area. So at this point, the only crimes that they had him officially connected to were the murder of Sophia Silva, the murder of the Lisk sisters, and the abduction and the rape of Kara Robinson. But Bonnie and Richard married in 1988, and there was record of her husband being arrested a year prior to their marriage. This was in January of 1987 for public indecency. Basically, a 15-year-old named Kelly Ballard was walking with her 3-year-old sister down the street in Florida when a man exposed himself to them and started masturbating while he walked past them. They got away from him, but then they saw him the next day in his car, wrote down his license plate number, and were able to tell the police. He was actually caught when a month later he arrived back at the port for the Navy, and then he entered a plea of no contest. He told police that he had a problem masturbating in front of girls, and he was sentenced to 3 years probation. Bonnie would then tell TikTok about her knowledge of the conviction prior to her marriage.
So what he had told me about it was that he had been blacked out drunk. I guess he had a really severe drinking problem. And he was apparently driving around naked. And some girls had seen him. This landed him arrested and in a rehabilitation center for his drug and alcohol addiction. By the next year, when we were starting to see one another, he had embraced his sobriety and his alcohol and drug-free lifestyle. Honestly, at the time, I was impressed. I thought that it took a lot of courage to face his inner demons and deal with the things that were causing him to drink.
Then the very year of Bonnie and Richard's marriage in 1988, investigators found that he could have committed his first murder, or at least one earlier than the ones that they suspected were his first in 1996. Bonnie's then husband, Richard, was a sonar technician aboard the ship based in Portland, Maine, which is why they had moved to Maine right after getting married. And on July 6th of 1988, a 12-year-old was abducted while babysitting in Maine. This was Sarah Margaret Cherry, and a few days later she was found in a wooded area. She was bound with a rope, strangled with a scarf, stabbed, sexually assaulted with birch sticks, and witnesses claimed that a white Toyota Corolla was near where Cherry's body was found. Now, investigators hadn't originally looked into Sarah Cherry's murder as being one of Richard's victims because 1 year after her murder, a different man had been arrested for the crime and was currently in prison. This was Dennis DeChain, who insisted from the beginning he was innocent, though his car receipt, he had a car repair receipt with his name on it, and also a notebook were found right outside of the home where Sarah Cherry was abducted. He then lied to investigators about his job, his address, what he was doing, why his truck was lost, and his truck ended up being found 450 feet from where Sarah's body was found, and the scarf and the rope on her body were linked to his truck. He said he only lied because he was doing illegal drugs at that time and that the evidence was taken from his truck and planted while he was doing drugs in the woods. But after the discovery of this serial killer, Richard Evanitz, investigators found that the Navy boat had been docked in Portland at the time of Sarah Cherry's murder, and Richard had also had access to a Toyota Corolla. But after Richard was caught due to Kara's escape, the founder of the Innocence Project wanted to link him to Sarah Cherry's murder, and so he tested the DNA found on her body to Richard, and it was deemed insufficient. Dennis DeChain is still incarcerated for her murder at this point. But Richard Evanitz was born to Joseph and Tess, and he had 2 siblings. His parents separated when he was young, got back together, separated when he was 12, and his dad was said to be an alcoholic who would bully everyone, call them morons. He allegedly drowned Richard's dog in front of him, and then Richard claimed that at 6, his father tried to drown him. His sister Jennifer would later say that their childhood was a prison, that they would get an A or get a beating. She said that she saw the pleasure in their dad's face of making them miserable. But after Bonnie was told about the killings during her marriage, she realized that the day that he killed Sophia Silva was a day when she was gone. She was taking a trip from home. Then after she divorced him and Richard remarried to Hope Marie Crawley, Hope was on a trip to Disney World when Kara Robinson was abducted. Hope Crawley also told the police she had no idea her husband was a murderer. Without trials and justice, the survivor, Kara Robinson, at only 15 years old, took it into her own hands to help these murder victims' families. She was angry at him for taking his own life, saying, "My feelings have gone back and forth over the years to feeling relief that he killed himself because I never had to go to trial." She ended up being the one to go and talk to Sophia and the Lisk sisters' families. But that's not all Kara has done. I've actually had the opportunity to speak with Kara, and she is not only such an inspiring survivor, but she is just a wonderful human being and has used her experience to make herself stronger, but also to empower so many on how to heal through traumatic circumstances and how to really seize the power of being a survivor. She has done this through her work in law enforcement, on her social media, through her speeches, her Lifetime movie called The Girl Who Escaped, and her podcast, Survivor's Guide to True Crime. Even Richard's ex-wife Bonnie mentioned in her TikTok that Kara was the one who survived. She was just the one who divorced him. However, I don't want to negate what Bonnie went through either, because I think that the trauma of domestic violence is something that should be taken seriously as well. And it seems like those rages were extremely scary for Bonnie, and just the mental and emotional abuse that occurred to her as well.
Back in 2002 when the FBI showed up at my door, I really didn't have any time to deal with it. I had 2 babies. I was, in shock about finding it out, and I really couldn't deal with it right then. I just kind of pushed it aside and, went about raising my kids. I didn't really have a chance to break down and deal with it at the time. And about 2 years later, I started having panic attacks, which, kind of landed me in the doctor's office, and into the therapist chair. And I had to take some medication for a while and go through a lot of therapy. And in therapy, I found out that I had PTSD from finding out such, traumatizing news.
But both of these women survived this monstrous man, and I'm so happy that they both decided to speak out about it and tell their stories. Bonnie wants to write a book about her experience and is hoping to get that published. I think that's why she's coming out with this story. And so I'm really, really looking forward to seeing that come out. So you can go and support Bonnie and Kara on their social media for their future efforts and helping others to speak out. I'll have everything linked down below to give them your time and just your listening ear. But the murders of Anne Caroline McDaniel and Alicia Showalter Reynolds are theorized to have been committed by Richard. However, their cases remain unsolved. And Sarah Cherry's case has technically been solved with a man in prison, though many believe that he was wrongfully convicted for the murder that Richard committed. And just a few months ago, the convicted killer, Dennis DeChain, requested a new trial, saying that the advances in DNA testing raises questions about his guilt. But how many murders do you think that Richard was responsible for? Does it surprise you that while he was killing, neither of his wives had any idea? Does it scare you that with his first wife, Bonnie, she talked to him about how scared she was of the unknown serial killer in the area, and he talked her out of it, saying that she wasn't the profile? She was going to be fine when he knew exactly what the profile was because it was his profile. But do you think Sarah Cherry was killed by Richard and the man in prison was wrongfully convicted? Let me know your thoughts down below. I want to give a huge thank you to Bonnie Lou for telling her story, for speaking out, and to Kara Robinson, who has always been vocal about what she went through and not letting it make her afraid. It has just made her this strong, empowered woman that I think every woman and man should look up to. But I'm proud of these women for using their voices for something so, so important. And so I just had to share it with you guys. So please go give them all of your support. You can follow me too if you would like to hear more cases like this and amplify the voices of those who truly deserve it. So don't forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay.